Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Episode, taking another fun and random episode for you guys this evening because over the weekend, Low Context Burning Rangers released 2 patches for the core demo disc that gives you 2 playable levels of Fighting Force. And interestingly enough, while Fighting Force never came out on the Sega Saturn, it did premiere on the PlayStation 1 and go to the Nintendo 64. It started its life as a Streets of Rage sequel on the Sega Saturn, and then it never actually saw release on the console it started development for. A little bit of a sad tale, but today we have some more playable fun. Before we get far involved, though, do me a huge favor, go down below, hit like and subscribe, and ring that notification bell. Definitely helps us out. And if you feel so inclined and want to support the channel, we got a Patreon link down below as well. But I absolutely love stuff like this, and 2024 is definitely shaping up to be 100% the year of Sega Saturn. All the MiSTer FPGA cores, all the different patches and new versions of games we know and love and remember coming to the system. It has been absolutely wild to see all of the new content, and Low Context Burning Rangers have been leading this, just going through pretty much every single Sega Saturn demo disc out there, and finding prototype, beta, and alpha versions of games that either did see release but have massive changes, or in the instance of Fighting Force, a game that never actually saw release on the Sega Saturn. And what's interesting is just how similar this is to the PlayStation 1 and Nintendo 64 version in design, but how also it feels completely different because it is running on the Sega Saturn. And I think this does look really good, especially because it was not finished. Now obviously this game did come out on Nintendo 64, so I'm giving you a look at what the intro looks like here, and you can already see just how close this prototype hews to the actual released game on Nintendo 64. Obviously we have more intro, but the overall layout of the first area here coming through to that gate and into that parking lot basically remained the same, it seems, throughout the entire development process. Now there are no real instances of any sort of prototype content existing when this was supposed to be a Streets of Rage sequel, but apparently the story goes that Sega told the developers that they were also working on a 3D Streets of Rage, so they pivoted and just basically made this Fighting Force, or it used to be called Judgment Force before it got a title change. But this is an awesome game. I always loved Fighting Force on PlayStation 1 and Nintendo 64. I don't think it quite lives up to the lofty levels of something like Die Hard Arcade, but of this generation, I think this is one of the better 3D beat 'em ups, and it's so much fun to see it side by side. Because if you take a look at the Nintendo 64 version here, it's both infinitely recognizable as the Sega Saturn version, but also has just enough changes that you can tell this is not the same version, and it did go through some iterative processes. Now let's put the Sega Saturn on the left of the Nintendo 64 on the right side by side. You can see the limousine turned into this gigantic A-Team van with Z-Corp on the side, and you really can't attack much of it here, where you in the Nintendo 64 version, you can kick it and punch it until the wheels fall off and you can use those to pick up and attack. Secondarily, on the Nintendo 64, you have full collision, and obviously in the Sega Saturn version you'll be seeing more later, there's pretty much no collision on anything. You can walk through walls, you can walk through objects, and you really can't pick anything in the environment up, so this is definitely an early build. And how this worked was, this was what's called an auto demo. You would see them a lot back in the day, where you'd pick something on a demo disc and it would basically play the game for you. Think of like a tool-assisted speedrun where all the inputs are controlled by the task and not by a human player. This was a way to demo a game when they didn't want to actually give the players controls. But Low Context Burning Rangers went through and basically patched out all of those automatic controls and gave the control back to the player, which is you or I, and that's absolutely so much fun to see. This is another preserved piece of the Sega Saturn history, and it's for an awesome game too, and considering he just did this for Panzer Dragoon, giving us 2 stages that were pre-release, it is just so much fun to see everything that the Sega Saturn is getting here in 2024. Now be aware, with the patches there are 2, and you need to patch the same file twice. So if you do unzip this demo disc, you want to unzip it into 2 different folders so that you have the first bin file that you can put patch 1 and patch 2 on independently, because you're going to be able to play this game as stage 1 or stage 2. Unfortunately, there's no other files on the disc, it seems, so you can't go much past this, but it is so much fun to see what actually happens. And you'll see here, once you actually defeat a level in the Saturn version, it just stops executing code, where in the Nintendo 64 version we're going to come into this office lobby and take a look at the heads-up display. It is quite different than what you're going to see on the Sega Saturn, but again, it's so interesting how similar it is to the pre-release version. And the soundtrack without any sound effects is quite good as well. Go ahead and listen for 45 seconds and I'll be right back. Awesome soundtrack, but obviously we have no sound effects in this build whatsoever. But as we go through the lobby of this office building, it gives me big Die Hard Nakatomi Tower vibes. I'm pretty sure the developers of this game were definitely watching some Die Hard in the background, which is really interesting because obviously I've already compared to this game to the actual Die Hard arcade, which was not the same in Japan when it was Dynamite Deka. But as you can see here, we can go right through the walls, and it's actually showing you more of the game than you would ever really see on PlayStation 1 or Nintendo 64 because collision was in fact there. And if we take a look at these side by side, again, it's so much fun to see the evolutionary process. Some of those gates have been applied to the left and right of the screen, so you can't immediately go anywhere you want in the game, versus here the gates are only in one direction, but of course we can walk straight through them. But it is very interesting just how close the Sega Saturn prototype that never actually released is to later revisions, because obviously the Nintendo 64 version came after the PlayStation 1 version, but it seems like the design has been dialed in very closely here, and if you believe rumors on the internet, this game was almost completely finished for the Sega Saturn before it was cancelled, but nothing in a build of that format has ever revealed itself, so hopefully one day it does come out. And if you take a look at the heads-up display at the top left-hand corner as well, that 100% screams Streets of Rage. It seems like that inspiration of what they wanted to partner with Sega for is still in this build. And if you walk through this door here, you're going to find your own character, Hawk, basically mangled up into a mess of polygons. It's like he's a human meatball, and I've never seen that before, so it was fun just to be able to kind of tour around outside of the environments to see what is hiding. Now, as far as the combat and collision detection are concerned, it definitely is not final here. There's going to be situations in which your fists and your feet just absolutely go through your opponent, and that life bar is a true life bar. If you die, it's going to restart the level, and I will show that to you in just a moment. But I feel like this, at least as the demo of the first couple areas of the game, is even still feeling pretty relatively complete. Sure, there's no collision detection, sure there's no sound effects, but you can tell the developers and the artists were really dialing in what this game was going to be when it did release on Sega Saturn, because this looks so close to the PlayStation 1 and Nintendo 64 versions while also having subtle changes, and that's always awesome to see. And it's such a bummer that this did not come out on Sega Saturn. It's very weird for a game to start development on one console and then get released on every other console of that generation except the target console that it started life on. If you can think of another instance, leave me a comment down below because I couldn't really think of anything. And you'll see here we can take another tour through this level where you're not supposed to be, and you'll see that infinite plane going into infinity, very similar to some of Sega's 3D fighting games on the Sega Saturn and even in arcades for Model 1 and Model 2. And some of the interactive elements do work and their scripting is there. This door is supposed to bust open and an enemy is supposed to rush out at you. The door does come out, but I would say the enemy AI definitely isn't as good as it is in the final game either. But again, this is just so amazing to see in 2024. We've gotten more betas, alphas, and prototypes on Sega Saturn in the last like 45 days than I feel like the last 2 years brought to us, and that is something to be celebrated. And this game is just one that I feel like most people are going to remember and have played. But leave me a comment down below and tell me what your experience with this game is. I would be curious who had it on PlayStation 1 and who had it on Nintendo 64 back in the day. I remember I got this on sale at EB Games for like 20 bucks, brought it home, and absolutely fell in love with it because I love pretty much every beat 'em up game, whether it's 2D or 3D. And you'll see here the AI can definitely be stupid, but I'm trying to die to show you what happens. The screen fades to red, and then this loading screen comes up, Fighting Force, Trademark Core Design Limited, and then it brings you right back into the start of the level again. If you beat the second stage, if you beat all the opponents in it, the game just basically stops executing code and you sit there forever. But if you want to play 2 different versions of Fighting Force today, 2 different prototypes, you can 100% do it, and I recommend you do. Bye bye.